What nobody tells you about the season right before it works. Carl Jung observed that the hardest hour in any true change is not the collapse itself, but the strange grey stretch that comes right after the collapse and right before the new thing has any shape at all. When nothing is broken anymore, but nothing is built yet either. And it is exactly there, in that unglamorous middle, that most people quietly give up. Before we go further, here is the premise Jung wrote in his 1931 essay, The Stages of Life, that we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning, because what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie, and he meant something very precise by this. Not that you failed, but that the very strategy which built your first house is now the thing standing in the way of the second one, and Jung would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? The season right before it works does not feel like progress. It feels like the ground rules you trusted your whole life quietly stopped applying, and nobody handed you the new rulebook." That gap, that unlit hallway between the old rules and the new ones, is the season nobody tells you about. And notice something else hidden inside Jung's own sentence. He did not say the morning program was foolish, or that you were naive to trust it. He said it was true, once, which means the discomfort you feel now is not evidence against your past self. It is evidence that time has simply moved and the map has not caught up yet. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. So let me say this plainly before anything else. If you are in a stretch right now where the old ambitions taste like ash and the new ones have not arrived yet, you are not broken, and you are not alone in this. Jung himself walked through a period exactly like this in his late 30s, and what he found on the other side, he could only find because he did not turn back. So here is my own resolution, spoken plainly. I stop mistaking the quiet, unlit middle for failure. I let the old program end, without demanding the new one arrive on command. I make the unconscious conscious. Say it with me. I make the unconscious conscious. Again. I make the unconscious conscious. If this is landing somewhere in you, subscribe, so that tomorrow's teaching finds you the same way this one did. And before the first key, if something in you just went quiet, type the 2 words "face it" in the comments, not as a performance for anyone else, just as a small honest seal on what you already know is true about your own season right now. The first key is that the season right before it works always looks, from the outside and even from the inside, exactly like the season where nothing is working at all, because you are no longer running the old program with its old confidence, and you are not yet running a new one with any confidence either. Jung named this precisely in his 1931 essay, writing that we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. Notice he did not say the morning program was wrong. He said it was true, once, for its own hour, and now its hour has passed. This is the part nobody tells you, that the discomfort you feel is not a sign the old plan failed. It is a sign the old plan finished its job and is now, quite naturally, obsolete. And here is the cruelty of it. The very fact that the old strategy worked so well for so long is exactly why its ending feels like collapse rather than completion. A thing that never worked is easy to abandon, but a thing that carried you for years earns a kind of loyalty in you. So when it stops fitting, you do not think, "This has simply finished its purpose." You think, "Something is wrong with me," and that misreading is the whole tragedy of this season. Imagine a man who built his whole identity on being the reliable one, the one who never says no, and for 20 years this served him beautifully. And then one day it simply stops fitting. The same behavior that once felt like strength now feels like a costume 2 sizes too small, and trying harder only tightens it further. Picture also a woman who spent 15 years proving herself capable at work, answering every email within the hour, and one grey Tuesday she reads an email she would have answered instantly a year ago, and she simply closes the laptop. Not out of rebellion, but because something in her has quietly stopped believing the old proof was ever the point. And picture a young father who always measured his worth by what he could provide, and finds himself on the floor building a block tower with his daughter, feeling no urge to check his phone, and afterward feeling almost guilty, as though he wasted an hour that could have proven something. Jung would say the guilt itself is the old program protesting its own retirement, and the season right before it works is exactly the discomfort of standing in an outgrown costume with the new one not yet sewn, the thread not even chosen, so of course it feels like nothing. There is nothing to show yet. But nothing to show is not the same as nothing happening. I stop calling the outgrown season a failure. The second key is that this season has a name. In Jung's own vocabulary, he called the whole arc individuation, coming to selfhood, and he was careful to call it a process, not an event, meaning it has phases, and one phase is loss before gain. In his essay Collected in Civilization in Transition, Jung wrote of coming to selfhood as a long unfolding, and he insisted the unlived portions of a life do not vanish when postponed, they wait, and they return as a demand precisely when the old program runs out of road. This is what explains the season right before it works. The emptiness is often the unlived life finally knocking, and the knock rarely arrives as a clear voice. It arrives sideways, restlessness, in a meeting that used to hold your attention, a heaviness on Sunday evening with no cause you can name, an old hobby from 20 years ago surfacing for no reason. Jung would say, none of this is random. The unlived life knocks in fragments and moods until you finally sit still enough to ask what it wants. Picture an ordinary Tuesday in this season. The tasks that once organized your whole day feel hollow. You do them anyway. And by evening, you sit in your own driveway an extra 4 minutes before going inside. Nothing wrong exactly, just nothing quite right. Picture too, a woman who spent 15 years perfecting the role of the capable one at work. And one evening, she stands in her kitchen, holding a paintbrush untouched since she was a student. Not painting, just holding it, feeling a pull she cannot explain. That pull is the unlived life, finally being given a hearing. And sometimes it arrives instead as irritability. A man snaps at his own child over nothing, and later, alone, he can admit the irritation was never about the question. It was some part of him straining against a life grown too narrow for whatever is trying to grow inside it. Jung would call this the unlived life, pressing from underneath, showing itself as friction, because friction comes easier than honest reflection. That driveway, that paintbrush, that unexplained sharpness. These are not malfunctions. Jung would tell you they are the real work, quietly announcing itself before words arrive. I let the unlived life ask its question without rushing to answer it. The third key is that Jung lived this exact season himself, and he did not disguise it in his memoir, in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. He described his own collapse around the age of 38, a period after his break from Freud, when the theories that had organized his whole intellectual life no longer satisfied him. And nothing yet had replaced them, respected, published, surrounded by colleagues, and then suddenly, none of that scaffolding held any weight for him. And here is the detail almost nobody repeats. He did not search harder for a new theory. He went down to the shore of Lake Zurich and began building small structures out of stones, the way a child builds a miniature village. No plan, no purpose he could explain to a colleague, just his hands moving and some deeper part of him allowed to lead for once. He kept at it for months, kneeling in the dirt until a shape simply suggested itself. A cottage, a tower, a small crooked church, and if you had watched from the outside, you would have called it aimless, wondered privately whether something had gone wrong in him. No paper being written, no reputation being built, and yet Jung came to see, only much later, that this exact unlit stretch was where the deepest material of his life's work was quietly forming. And this was not an afternoon that resolved itself by the weekend. It stretched across years, he later admitted, were the most disorienting of his life. with no promise, no guarantee, only the trust of returning. Think of a field left fallow for a season. The farmer who does not know the land sees only bare dirt, but the farmer who understands it knows the fallow season is the ground recovering the strength the next crop will need. And Jung's stones by the lake were exactly this kind of fallow field. Picture something more ordinary alongside it. A man who loses his job after 20 years and finds himself, on a random Tuesday, sorting through a box of old photographs on the kitchen floor for no reason he can name, not organizing them, simply sitting with them for an entire afternoon, and something in him is quietly reassembling itself in that unremarkable hour, the same way Jung's hands were reassembling something at the edge of that lake. And picture one more. A woman recovering from a long illness who spends a month rearranging the furniture in one small room, never satisfied, and she cannot explain to her teasing sister that the rearranging was never about the couch, it was about finding some arrangement of her own life that finally felt livable again. This is what nobody tells you, that the fertile season and the barren-looking season are, very often, the same season, seen from two different distances. Up close it looks like a grown man wasting his afternoons, or a woman endlessly moving a couch. From a distance of years, it looks like the beginning of everything he would ever write, or the quiet turning point of her recovery. And here is the practical weight of this key. If you are in the middle of your own version of this right now, you cannot see it from that later distance yet. You can only choose whether to stay in the room with the discomfort, stones in hand, so to speak, or flee it by grabbing some old familiar distraction that promises to make you feel useful before you are ready. Jung stayed by the lake. He let his hands do what his mind could not yet explain. And that patience is nearly the whole secret. I stay in the room even when I cannot yet see what the room is for. The fourth key is that this season shows up most sharply for people who were, by every outward measure, successful in the first half of life. Jung described in his Stages of Life essay how a man can arrange his whole existence around the ambitions of youth, the career, the status, the acquisitions, and reach a point where all of that arrives, and finds it does not satisfy the way it was supposed to. Notice how strange this is. It is not the failures who feel this season most sharply. It is the ones who did everything right, the ones who kept every promise the morning program made to them. And still, one ordinary afternoon, we felt the floor go thin beneath the achievement. Imagine a retired businessman who spent 40 years building a company, who measured every year by growth, by contracts closed, by the size of the office, and then he retires, and the company runs fine without him. And for the first time in decades, there is no scoreboard, no quarterly report, no ledger to check at the end of the day and say, "There, I mattered today." Jung wrote of exactly this kind of man, describing how such a man, without his old program, can feel that a significance of its own has gone missing from his days. Not because he lost anything material, but because the entire orientation that gave his hours meaning has quietly expired. And here is what makes it so disorienting. There is no funeral for a scoreboard, so the grief has nowhere to go, and his instinct, trained by 40 years of habit, is to build a new scoreboard immediately. A hobby turned competitive, a new venture, anything measurable, anything to avoid the silence. A man who takes up competitive golf the week after retirement, chasing a handicap the way he once chased quarterly targets, may feel relief for a while, but Jung would gently point out that he has simply built a smaller scoreboard to hide from the same silence, and the silence will wait, patiently, for as long as it takes. So picture that same man sitting by the window instead of rushing to the desk, not because he has found the answer, but because he has finally stopped demanding one on schedule. That unproductive hour by the glass, Jung would call the beginning of listening. I let the silence do its work instead of filling it in a panic. The fifth key is the deepest one, and it takes some unfolding, so let it unfold in pieces. First, consider that the season right before it works is not measured in days or weeks the way a project deadline is. Jung was explicit that individuation, this coming to selfhood, unfolds on its own timeline. not on the timeline of the ego's impatience. And this alone explains why the season feels endless while you are in it. You keep checking for the marker that tells you it is almost over, and there is no marker, because the process is not a countdown, it is a slow reorganizing of the whole psyche. And slow reorganizing does not announce its own progress in a way the conscious mind can track day to day. Second, consider what actually happens underneath the surface during this season. Even though nothing visible seems to be happening, Jung would say, the unconscious is doing the work that the ego cannot do by will alone. The old attitudes are being slowly dismantled, not violently, but the way a house is unbuilt board by board, and new attitudes are being slowly assembled from material the ego has not even met yet. Dreams shift in this season, moods shift, old certainties stop feeling certain, and none of this is decay. It is disassembly in service of a rebuild you cannot see the blueprint for yet. Third, consider why this season is so often mistaken for failure, and here is the honest answer. Because our culture has almost no vocabulary for productive emptiness, we are trained to read stillness as stagnation and silence as absence. So when a person enters this exact season, the season right before it works, their own inner voice, borrowed from that culture, tells them something has gone wrong, that they are behind, that they should already have the new program installed and running, and this self-judgment is often more damaging than the season itself, because it adds shame on top of an already disorienting stretch. Jung's whole insistence in the Stages of Life essay was gentler than this. He was simply describing a natural phase, the way autumn is a natural phase, and not a failed summer. Fourth, consider a woman who spent years learning to play an instrument by following sheet music exactly, note for note, and reached a point where she could play anything placed in front of her with real skill, and then her teacher told her it was time to improvise, to make something of her own, and for months her playing sounded worse than it had in years, clumsy, hesitant, full of false starts. She assumed she was losing whatever gift she once had, but nothing was being lost. The old skill of precise reading was quietly stepping aside, so a new skill of listening inward could take its place. And there is no way to develop the second skill without passing through a stretch where the first one no longer applies and the second one has not yet arrived. This is exactly Jung's picture of the psyche mid-transition, competent in the old way, clumsy in the new way, and judged harshly for the clumsiness by a mind that has forgotten it is watching a rebuilding. Fifth, consider the ordinary shape of a week inside this season, so it stops feeling abstract. Monday, you go through your usual motions and something in you resists them without explanation. Tuesday, you catch yourself staring out a window mid-task, not distracted exactly, just elsewhere. Wednesday, an old ambition that used to excite you gets mentioned, and you feel nothing, which frightens you more than the ambition itself ever did. Thursday, you have one small unexpected moment, a piece of music, an old memory, a stranger's sentence, that lands with more weight than it should, and you cannot say why. Friday, you are tired in a way that sleep does not fix, and Saturday, if you are lucky, you finally sit still long enough to notice that none of this week was wasted. It was the quiet disassembly Jung described, happening in real time, in an ordinary week, in an ordinary life. And Sunday, quietly, without any announcement, you find yourself doing one small thing differently than you would have a month ago, answering a question more slowly, noticing a feeling before reacting to it, and you almost do not register it as anything at all. And yet, it is the first faint outline of the new configuration, arriving exactly the way dawn arrives, without a seam you can point to. Sixth, consider that this same pattern repeats at every scale of the process, the way a single week mirrors the single season, and the single season mirrors the whole of a life. The psyche does not build in one long, smooth motion. It builds the way a tide comes in, forward and back, and each backward pull can feel, from inside, like losing ground you already earned, when it is often only the tide gathering itself for the next forward reach. And this is why a person can feel, in the same month, one week that seems full of quiet hope, and the very next week, a return of the old heaviness, and mistake the second week for proof the first week meant nothing, when Jung would say both weeks belong to the same tide. And seventh, consider what actually ends this season. Not force, not a 5-step plan, not gritting your teeth harder than before. Jung's whole method with his patients past midlife was to help them stop fighting the transition and start attending to it, noticing dreams, noticing the pull of the unlived life, noticing what stirs unexpected feeling. Because attention, not force, is what lets the new configuration finish assembling itself. And this is the part nobody tells you. The season right before it works ends not when you finally push hard enough, but when you finally stop pushing against the very process that is quietly building the next chapter underneath your notice. And eighth, one last thing worth holding. Jung never promised his patients a date. He never told the retired businessman, or the woman with the paintbrush, or the man building stone villages by a lake exactly when the season would end, because he did not know, and he did not pretend to know. What he offered instead was simply the assurance that the season was not meaningless, that its very shapelessness was doing shaping work, and that assurance, modest as it sounds, was often the only thing that kept a person from abandoning the process in its hardest hour. I stop pushing against the season and start paying attention to what it is building. The sixth key is the quiet one, and it is simply this. The season right before it works is not a punishment, and it is not a delay. It is the actual mechanism. Jung's whole picture of coming to selfhood was never a straight line from ambition to achievement. It was a long unfolding, where the unlit middle is not separate from the outcome, but is the outcome's own workshop. And here is why this is so easy to miss. Dawn does not arrive the way we picture it in our minds. We imagine a switch, darkness, then light. But anyone who has actually stood outside before sunrise knows the truth is stranger and slower than that. The sky does not turn from black to gold. It turns from black to a gray, so faint you doubt your own eyes. And for a long while, far longer than feels reasonable, nothing seems to change at all. You could stand there checking your watch, certain the process has stalled, and the whole time the light is already moving toward you, simply not yet at the threshold where your eyes can register it as progress. Imagine a man standing at a train platform before sunrise, waiting for a 5 a.m. train, and for 20 full minutes, the sky looks exactly the same to him, unchanging, flat, discouraging, and he has no way of knowing, standing there, that the light is in fact arriving at a perfectly steady rate the entire time. It is only his eyes that are too slow to register the early portion of the change, and if you asked him, at minute 12, whether dawn was coming, he might honestly answer that he could not tell, and he would be wrong. And this is Jung's picture of the unlit season exactly. So if you are standing in yours right now, in the driveway for 4 extra minutes, in the silence after the scoreboard disappeared, in the week where nothing seemed to happen, in the stones stacked with no plan, you are not standing outside the process looking in. You are standing exactly inside it. The season right before it works has already begun its work in you, whether you can feel it yet or not. And Jung's quiet confidence, the confidence he only earned by living through his own version of this at 38, was that the unfolding does not require your certainty to keep unfolding. It only requires your willingness to stay standing on the platform a little longer than feels comfortable, not because you can prove the light is coming, but because you have decided not to leave before it arrives. I trust the unlit season is already doing the work it came to do. Here is the whole picture. The old program ends before the new one shows its shape. The unlived life returns as a quiet demand. Once the old plan runs out of road, Jung himself sat inside this exact darkness at 38 and did not flee it. Success in the first half of life makes the silence of this season sharper, not softer. The real work underneath is slow disassembly and rebuilding that the ego cannot rush or witness directly, and none of it requires force, only attention and the willingness to remain. And if you look closely, you will see these 6 keys were never 6 separate ideas. They were 6 turns of one single key. The recognition that the season right before it works is not the opposite of the work, it is the work, disguised as nothing happening. So if you are in that unlit hallway tonight, between a program that stopped fitting and a life that has not yet found its new shape, you are not behind, and you are not forgotten by the process. You are simply in the part of the story that never gets photographed. I make the unconscious conscious, and I will say it once more with you before we close. I make the unconscious conscious. So tell me, gently, what might it mean to stop waiting for proof that this season is working, and start trusting that the waiting itself, quiet and unglamorous as it is, was the work all along?